and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Budget 2025 was tabled in Dewan Rakyat today, and now the crucial evaluation begins. What does this budget get right, and where did it fall short? Joining me on the show to discuss this further is Danial Rahman, CEO of the think tank Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute, better known as ASLI, and Doris Liew, Economist and Assistant Research Manager at Ideas Malaysia's Public Finance Unit. Dan and Doris, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today. So I'll begin by getting your initial reactions to Budget 2025. Doris, if I may begin with you.
All right, maybe I will look at it from two angles. First, on the fiscal consolidation, which has been Anwar's pivotal policies since he assumed office in 2022. So he passed the Public Finance and Fiscal Responsibility Act in 2023, wanting to reduce the deficit to 3% of GDPs and debt to GDP ratios to 60% of GDP. So this budget was actually, we can see that there are some reduction in this sense, that there's an expected reduction of fiscal deficit from 4.3% of GDPs to 3.8% of GDP. We are a little more cautiously optimistic about that because while there is some fiscal consolidation effort, we find that the debt services charge remains quite high at 13% of GDP. And if you look at as a percentage of revenue gain, 15.8% of the revenue goes to servicing our debt in 2024, and this increased to 16.3% in 2025 budget. Okay. So we see that there is an increase in this. At the same time, revenue is not increasing fast enough to keep pace with our spending. There is one concern over there that we can talk about it a little bit more. Second is about the trade and investments area, that I see a positive sign that there is an alignment with the NIMP and National Semiconductor Strategy that was announced this year. And there is a good indicators to businesses that we are actually consolidating our policies around these topics, and that gives a lot of business confidence in that. So there are some incentives that go through the new investment framework, particularly in IC design and advanced manufacturing, which has been announced by Anwar as well.
So we'll come back and talk a little bit about that, because I think that's really an interesting angle of this budget, how the business community might respond to it. But Dad, if I may come to you, in terms of just picking up on what Doris has mentioned about the fiscal responsibility of this budget, I think about the fact that government's expenditure on emoluments is very high, significantly high already, and it will increase with the civil service pay hike. What did it speak to you in terms of the government's economic priorities? Did they get it right in this budget?
I think they definitely did. I would characterize it as being a very brave budget. So on one hand, it's aligned with what the government wants to do with the Madani economy framework. So a year in from the framework, we see real wages for the informal sector having gone up by about 9%, right? So what Prime Minister is doing on two prongs. Firstly, raising the ceiling, as he's spoken about, and all the new investments which are coming in and which are then expected to generate income and revenue, not just for the people, but also generate jobs. And secondly, raising the floor, which is to ensure that people are able to live with dignity, and that comes with the increase in minimum wages, greater investments in different areas by the GLCs, more public-private partnerships, right? So to answer your question, yes, this will lead to an increase in government expenditure, as you've mentioned, but the government has also looked at two other ways to increase the funding of it. Number one, which is by removing certain subsidies. We can talk more about that later. And number two is by increasing sources of revenue. So whether it's some taxation, or whether it's through external fundings, or direct investment, or foreign direct investment. And just kind of like to wrap that up, I think the economy is riding very strongly on a strengthening ringgit, so that also helps foreign exchange and exports, number one. Number two, Bursa's trading has been buzzing, so we see a lot more investments coming in. And number three, FDI is at a record high, as the Prime Minister has mentioned. So in that sense, the economy is boding well. So for the Prime Minister to announce this expansionary budget, 421 billion at this point in time, is quite brave. The some may say he should have gone further with some of the harder bits. But
Okay,
maybe we'll get
well,
to that later.
so for me, one of the things that I thought was quite interesting was the fact that so in his budget speech, the Prime Minister said that there will be no mega projects. And traditionally, I think mega projects have been seen as this kind of driver of economic growth and jobs. What did you make of that, and what were, for you, what was missing in this budget? What would you have liked to see that you may not have heard announced this evening?
I think just very quickly first on mega project, I think also where the Prime Minister is coming from is that mega projects can often be seen as a bit of vanity, a bit of legacy. But nevertheless, we still see this government supporting infrastructure projects for the benefit of the rakyat, like Pen Borneo, which will be continuing and I believe will benefit the people of Sabah and Sarawak and the development there, right? But I think so that's the first thing. But on the second part, as you've asked, I also think it's about ensuring that the government prioritizes other matters such as the consolidation of services, ensuring that there's an increase in what needs to be done from a public service delivery perspective. So we also saw the Prime Minister talk about extended hours, UTC playing a bigger role. We see him talking about, what's the word, the services, the mobile services for rural areas. So, you know, enough of looking at big projects, big capital investment per se, but allocate resources accordingly to what impacts the people on the ground. So in that sense, the budget has been very much people-centric this year.
You're right. I mean, there was a big focus on public service delivery, how to make sure that is more efficient and more inclusive. Doris, what was missing for you in this budget?
I think just to continue on with the mega project stuff, I think we can see the government moving away from fully funding a major infrastructure project to more private funding. So for instance, high-speed rail, for instance, government did not want to put in fund from public sectors, but inviting more private sectors involvement in these projects. And we can see a lot of PPP initiative like PICAS, which was just announced recently that the government is heading toward that direction. And if we look at the budget itself across years, especially for MOH, there's an increased allocation and increased portion that deploy PPP for their new hospitals and new facilities. So we see there is a trend there, and this is likely to continue. And this part is actually good for fiscal consolidation effort as it reduces on government spending and as well as increasing efficiency when the private sectors are involved.
So you see that trend going forward. Dan, you wanted to
I just want to add a little bit. Sorry, I kind of missed the point about what I felt was missing. I think first, there's still some questions about funding some large parts of the budget, whether or not the subsidy cuts and the revenue targets are realistic. Second, not much is mentioned about sin taxes. So, you know, nothing on tobacco, nothing on alcohol, for instance, on whether there should be more taxes coming from there. I think third would also be detailing on some of the subsidy rationalization approaches. I think you know, there was mention of Draw 95, which everybody was waiting. And last, for me, what was also missing was perhaps a bit more on nutrition, especially childhood nutrition when it comes to funding early years of a child's growth. Because there was a lot mentioned about additional funds for children, for early school care, for RMT, Rancangan Makanan Tambahan, or the food meals and all that. So I think these are just some of the things that were missing.
Doris, you also noticed an absence of early childhood education focus, right?
Definitely. So currently, government's expenditure on early childhood education is at 2.2% of the expenditure, whereas the UNICEF target is actually 10% of GDP.
Oh, that's still a far way to go.
Very far away from there. And there doesn't seem to be an increase in allocation based on the budget speech today. So that is missing from the budget. And that is despite increased allocation to Ministry of Education.
That's right.
So
it's the biggest allocation.
Definitely. So if it's not going to early childhood education, then we are missing the opportunities there, because early childhood education is actually the most important part of the childhood development that determine their future's career and trajectory. So that is important. Secondly, what we see missing here is the opportunity to raise new taxes. So, for instance, there's nothing major in raising our tax revenue, and we can see that the tax revenue currently is only at 12.4% of GDP and is projected in 2025, definitely way less than upper middle income country of 18.8%. And And this is a missing opportunity because right now economy is riding high, GDP is growing well, unemployment rate is at 3.3%, inflation rate is at 1.8% to 1.9%.
Okay. What did you make of the fact that the SST was expanded? I mean, it was announced, but you don't think it went far enough?
So for SST, it was expanded, but it's mostly on luxury goods items, non-essential.
Avocados. I mean, all the millennials thinking about the avocado toast.
So how big is that in the larger scheme of how much is that avocado sectors out of the total goods consumed in Malaysia? And definitely that's not going far enough. That is a very small portion of our tax. And I mean, in the projection of fiscal policy, that doesn't have a significant increase in the SST that make so much difference in our tax revenue.
It feels like it would be significant. Because obviously there was a lot of calls for the GST coming back. Even the World Bank has made a call for that. And people are talking about it in a phasal manner. But the Prime Minister seems to have taken a lot of care to want to couch it such that more conversation needs to be done with certain stakeholders before it is rolled out next year. I actually feel that it will be a significant contribution to the coffers, but I also think that means the amount could go up to a certain point, because the PM did say it's also about the progressive taxation of it all. So how progressive it gets, I think that's to be seen. But it seems that there's more than meets the eye. I think we'll have to stay tuned for it.
So maybe it's priming the ground for now. All right, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll come back and discuss more about the allocations under Budget 2025 in just a few minutes. Stay tuned to consider this.
AWANI International is your gateway to global news, insights and stories that matter. From breaking headlines to in-depth analysis, stay connected with the world right here where you won't miss a beat.
Dari keturunan dukun yang terhandal. Aku dukun yang tangkap hantu. Panggil saja Don Ari.
Apa signifikan dengan pengumuman ataupun berita yang keluar dari media China ini berkaitan dengan hasrat Malaysia untuk menyertai gabungan BRICS?
Kita mau dapat lebih banyak umpamanya pelaburan daripada negara China.
Kalau melihat kepada Akta Kanak-Kanak 2001, adakah kita terlalu lambat untuk melihat proses untuk meminda Akta Sedia Ada?
Kita perlu ada penyelarasan. Kita tak mahu bekerja secara silo.
Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me tonight is Danial Rahman from the think tank ASLI and Doris Liew from think tank Ideas Malaysia. And we're talking about Budget 2025 that was announced earlier today. Part of the budget speech was the announcement of a timeline for the targeted subsidy plan for RON 95, whether it will be implemented by the middle of next year. I wanted to get your thoughts on that because this was something that we had been kind of expecting. Now we have a clear kind of timeline, but no real details. Dan, if I may get your thoughts on that. I mean, in terms of how the diesel subsidy was rolled out earlier this year, what would you like to see from now until mid of next year happen so that we get the kind of targeted subsidy rollout right?
Right. I think it's also important to take a step back very quickly and understand that a lot of care was taken into, I think, you notice when PM, he said it's 80 billion subsidy bill last year, but with true savings that the government has initiated, the government has saved 1.2 billion by floating the price of chicken, 4 billion diesel, a few more billion through electricity rationalization, but nevertheless, a majority of people still benefit from it. His premise is that the blanket subsidies unfairly benefit the T20 and non-citizens in that regard. So with the announcement, I think it's also very clear that 85% of Malaysians will continue to enjoy the subsidy, so which is approximately 12.5 billion ringgit, whereas 8 billion more, which was for the T15 income group of earners, are the ones who will effectively not have it. So I think that's also very brave by the Prime Minister to do. I think some people or economists would have liked him to push it a little bit more, but I think this strikes a very fair balance in light of rising cost of living, inflation, so on and so forth. So this is actually a very good way to moderate the markets from unnecessary inflation. I think that's the first. The second part in terms of the rollout, there's been an indication that it will start sometime in May. I think that's, I think it would be nice to see it come a bit earlier so that the government can then start to save the subsidy from the T15 group and then redeploy it to other social programs and other social goods. But assuming it happens in May, I think that's also because they need to integrate systems.
Need some time.
Need some time. I think what was quite timely and something that will probably have more discussion is about the consolidation of the databases of LHDN, JPJ and PADU under My Digital ID, because that will be truly crucial in ensuring that the rollout of the subsidy is able to reach the people who deserve it. So the big question now is how do you get to the 85%? And I think this consolidation is actually very timely. It'll be technical, it'll be timely, but I think this also pushes Malaysia on that digital innovation path that we've always needed to be on par with countries like Estonia, even like China. So it really is a good path in that regard.
Right. Doris, what do you think about the subsidy rationalization? Clearly, it's coming. And the idea is that we save money here, but we deploy it elsewhere. In terms of how that might impact the economy, do you have concerns about inflation, as Dan just mentioned?
Definitely. So if you look at the economic projection, inflation right now is low at 2%, but the projection for next year for the CPI is going to be 2 to 3.5%. And we can see that the government has factored in some impact from the petrol rationalization into its figure. At the same time, we look at also the government's attempt to help cost of living in the next year by increasing the sumbangan tunai rama from 10 billion to 13 billion, 3 billion ringgit increase. So we can see that it's some form of help and assistance in the rationalization.
So coupling the rationalization of subsidies with cash transfers, that's the idea. What do you make, how do you think the business community will respond to this budget, Doris? Is this a business and investment friendly budget?
I see it as a positive budget for businesses because a lot of the alignments that was announced in the previous frameworks and plan are actually being implemented in the budget. So it means that something and some allocation is intended for these purposes, and the business community are definitely in line with that. Second, we can see that there are some incentives for businesses in the Johor Singapore Special Economic Zone and the Selangor IC Design Park, so that the incentive announced will further attract investments into Malaysia, which has seen FDI this year was at a record high, and next year is also projected to go high. And then we see in global semiconductor industries that Malaysia is one of the pioneers, particularly in the downstream processing. And definitely that is going to increase. But at the same time, we want to move to high-value, high-growth sectors of IC and research and development, and no longer just being in the downstream processing. So moving from there, we can see that the government also provided more TVET allocation from 6.8 billion last year to 7.5 billion this year, and more allocations to the universities to train up people, to train up engineers to fill in the high-value, high-growth sectors. So the effort from plan to implementation is actually clearly seen.
So you get the businesses to come in, make sure that we have the kind of human capital for it. Dan, how does this tie into what was allocated for education and higher education, particularly TVET.
Yeah, first I say I really like how Doris had analysed that. I was going to say, like, hey,
you pulled it all together, Doris.
You pulled it all together. Education, multiple prongs here. Of course, Ministry of Education at the basic level has got the highest funding once again. I think that's extremely crucial because we need to start that from early on. In relation of a couple of weeks ago, the government also announced the program Anak Kita, which was about overcoming learning losses at 100 million. So in that regard, the government firmly has its eyes on primary education. Now, at the secondary level, the government also announced a few things. There was some funding for artificial intelligence, especially. So there was
a big focus on AI, wasn't there?
There was a huge focus on artificial intelligence. Of course, there have been news reports about AI generating trillions in terms of investments in time to come and thousands of jobs. I think there was one number that said something like 500,000. for example, will look at medical AI, UPM, technology, crypto, quantum, USM, semiconductor, UKM, AI for languages. Of course, you know, some might say, what's up with AI in that regard? But I think it's quite exciting, and we are definitely on the higher end of the curve. What I think was also very much appreciated is the fact that the Prime Minister said that all these investments coming in must have an impact on the ground.
That's right,
because there have been some criticisms about, well, AI data centers are not going to generate jobs because you don't really need people to work there. But I think that's where the ancillary services, the technical expertise are still needed. So just echoing on from Doris, I think the movement from downstream or low TVET to high TVET is something that the government is emphasizing on. I think that will bode well in the long run. We've just got to stay the course, and I think the budget sets the kind of parameters and the ground for it. There's some funding for STEAM as well within schools.
Right.
So it seems that the planning is there, but with Malaysia, it's always about execution.
That's right. So whether or not this will translate into higher wages, because that's so much of what we're discussing about taxes and removal of subsidies, all of that predicates on the fact that wages need to increase. So there was some mention about minimum wage being set at now 1,700 and then having kind of a starting salary guideline.
Sure.
So Dan, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think just as a reminder that only about 32% of GDP is reflective of wages. The rest are retained incomes by organizations, which suggests that Malaysia has this problem with artificially suppressed wages, and that can definitely grow. And the Prime Minister has mentioned that multiple times in the past. That's first. Now, in relation to your point, we see that the states of Johor and Selangor quite proactively have now said that because they're getting more investments in semiconductors and artificial intelligence, they expect that the starting salaries range from anywhere from 4,000 to 7,000 ringgit. In other words, signaling really the fact that, you know, to the global market as well, that, hey, if you want our graduates and our talent, treat them well and pay them well. Because for a long time, I think it's been an industry secret that you can get good talent in Malaysia at low wages. Right. Now, in the budget, what was quite interesting was that while PM announced the minimum wage at 1.7, he also made a point to say that for TVET graduates, companies should no longer be allowed to start them at 1.7. There were no details on that yet, but I thought that was also very consistent in terms of sending the message out that it's time for Malaysia to move up, and the government will play a role to arbiter wages in times to come. And as I said earlier on also, second year into the Economy Madani framework, in formal sector wages are up 9%. So this is the kind of momentum that we need.
Doris, what do you think about the kind of now what's been announced? Is that enough to spur the kind of increase we want to see wages?
If it is like government regulations, then businesses has no choice but to follow it. But what we want to observe is that it's a national minimum wage really what we should go for, because if we look at the sectorial and even regional wages and kind of cost of living and business costs, it varies in different states of Malaysia, from rural and urban region, that also varies. So while we want increases in wages, definitely in Johor, Singapore, SEZ area, that there is a lot of investment going in there, that could be a higher minimum wage. But at the same time, in places that are more rural in area, if we increase the minimum wage, then businesses may not be able to cope with this increase in cost. And then they will affect some job and some insecurities in those states. So we want to have a balance, and we want to see how to move away from this national minimum wage to a more focused, targeted and sectorial one. that will be one part of it. And second part of it is also for the STEM education, AI sectors. We want to train a lot of engineers and graduates, but also if you want to train high-skilled TVET graduates, it's important for them to have a good foundation of science and technology before we are able to train them for high-tech sectors. If they are not if they are just graduating from SPM, they don't have a basic foundation, it's difficult. It takes years to train them up to be industry ready. So we want to be cognizant of how we align that with our university curriculums and also some of the TVET courses that are offered out there.
So in the couple minutes that we have left, I do want to get your thoughts. I mean, this has been quite a, I must say, quite a robust budget. There was a lot of ground that was covered in the 2.5 hours that the Prime Minister gave his speech. When we think about the outcomes of Budget 2024, right, in the past year, what is it that you want to see in terms of charting a trajectory in the next year? So this is essentially, it's a midterm budget. I was surprised that the government has now announced kind of important decisions around subsidy rationalisation, around taxation and all that. The question is, what is it that you want to see implemented and implemented well over the next year to make sure that, the week before Budget 2026, we're assessing Budget 2025 and it's done correctly? Doris, may I begin with you?
Sure.
Maybe I want to see that some mechanism in place to, for instance, petrol rationalization, how the governments are able to implement the digitalization system, how it makes use of the existing LHDN and also PADU system, because right now we don't see a consolidation of that. We know that PADU has been up there and running, but we have not seen a material use cases for that. And we want to see how all the government expenses to create all this new system will be implemented in real life, and petrol rationalization will be the first test of it. Secondly, for the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Health, where if they are given the highest allocation of budget, top 2 allocation of budget, we definitely want to see that whether it leads to an increase in outcome for health outcome and education outcome, right? So we want to see whether there will be a increase in primary enrollment rate, whether there is a decrease in dropout rate, which is a significant issue after COVID, whether that leads to more learning opportunities, because as we can see, learning loss is a pivotal issue in our education system. People going into the school but not getting enough education out of it, like some 9 years out of 11 years of education, which is like really poor, and it leads to going low income job, etc. In the Ministry of Health as well, like how long term, how we want to have some kind of sustainable system for our healthcare sectors, because right now our population is aging and there doesn't seem to be a plan or end stage about how do we cope with the increased cost in health sectors every year.
Sure. Dan, we're running out of time,
How
but
much time do we have?
two.
So a few things. I think first, renewable energy is going to play a pivotal role in the years to come. Look, climate change is a crisis and an emergency. We also need to invest more in planetary health. The government has a number of incentives in place. So I think, come Budget 2026, I want to look back and say, has the carbon tax mechanism been sorted out? Have we also now invested more? Because, the flooding that we see every time it rains in Kuala Lumpur, we are worried that a tree might fall on us, that kind of thing. I think this is where the government is getting serious, but we want to see that follow through first. Second, we also see more social protection. I really like the government announcing the compulsory contributions for foreign workers, the extension of investments in the private retirement scheme to 2030, that extension of tax reliefs for parental care, for insurance, etc., etc. So there's a lot of focus on caring for the rakyat and for people around them and for the workers. So I think come next year, it's also good to see how this has been achieved. I think last, maybe very quickly, is also about ASEAN. We'll be taking the lead in ASEAN next year. The budget is an opportunity to expand Malaysia's presence from a tourist perspective, from an ASEAN integrated perspective, and I think, as Doris have mentioned, on technology, innovation, digitalization. Since that's a big push in Malaysia, I think what we're doing here can also be a model across Southeast Asia to accelerate the region when it comes to digital assimilation, monetary integration, for example, movement of trades of goods. So a lot of the so how I would tie this is a lot of the FDI is coming from Europe, China, and the US. now let's start looking at how the ASEAN region export-import ports move for the next year. I think that would be quite exciting.
Both of you, we covered a lot of ground today, so thank you so much for being on the show with me. I appreciate your time. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. But before I leave you tonight, we have some exciting news. Astro AWANI's brand new English news platform will go live on Monday, October 21st. So get your comprehensive coverage of global affairs all at one place, international.astroawani.com. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching and good night.